It was a typical quiet afternoon at Delaney's Diner, a local eatery nestled on the corner of Fifth and Oak. The place had always been a refuge for anyone seeking a comforting meal in a place that felt like home. On most days, it bustled with the chatter of regulars, a blend of the town's old timers, veterans, and weary travelers passing through. The comforting hum of the coffee machine and the smell of bacon frying in the kitchen set the atmosphere for what should have been a peaceful and uneventful day. Among the usual crowd, there was a man who stood out. He was a black veteran, his weathered face lined with the stories of a lifetime of service. His uniform jacket, faded with age but still adorned with the insignia of his military division, told the story of a decorated soldier who had served his country with pride. His name was Thomas Caldwell, though the people who knew him simply called him Mr. Caldwell. He had lived in this town for many years after retiring from the military, but his experiences stretched far beyond these small town streets. He had fought in wars, witnessed atrocities, and fought for equality both on and off the battlefield. Yet through it all, he remained a humble man who carried his stories only when asked and preferred to let others speak of his accomplishments. On this particular afternoon, he entered the diner with a quiet demeanor, his military jacket buttoned neatly, the slight jingle of the medals on his chest almost rhythmic as he moved. He chose a booth by the window, one that had become his usual spot, where he could watch the world go by while sipping his coffee and enjoying a simple meal. He had no agenda, no grand plans for the day, just the peace of solitude in a familiar place. Megan, the waitress, had worked at the diner for a few months now. She was in her 20s, a young woman with a sharp attitude and a tendency to keep to herself. She was new to town, having moved from a larger city in search of something quieter, something more authentic. The diner was a stepping stone for her, a place to earn money while she figured out her next move. Megan had heard the stories of the regulars, the ones who came in every day, sat at the same booths, and ordered the same meals. But Mr. Caldwell was different. He wasn't just a regular. He was a veteran, one of those types whose presence seemed to demand respect without saying a word. She had seen him in the diner before, of course, but always from a distance. There was something about him, his calm composure, his serious expression, that made her uneasy. Maybe it was because, deep down, Megan had never fully understood the weight of what some veterans went through. She didn't know what it was like to serve, to sacrifice, to fight for a cause she barely understood. She wasn't proud of it, but she'd always viewed veterans like Mr. Caldwell as reminders of a past she didn't care to engage with. And there was something about his presence that triggered an almost irrational discomfort in her. When he sat down at the booth by the window, Megan rolled her eyes, letting out a small sigh before walking over to take his order. She put on her usual customer service smile, trying to mask her internal hesitation. "What can I get you today?" she asked, her tone clipped but polite, though there was a subtle edge to her voice that betrayed a lack of enthusiasm. Mr. Caldwell looked up from his menu, offering her a warm but reserved smile. He was used to people not fully understanding him or what he had seen during his years of service. But he didn't let it bother him. He was here for a meal, not to explain his life story. "I'll have the eggs and toast," he replied quietly. But Megan, without skipping a beat, gave him a curt nod, her eyes narrowing slightly. She was hesitant, but not for the reason one might expect. She had noticed his skin color, his military jacket, and for some reason, it made her feel unsettled. She didn't fully comprehend why she felt the way she did, but something in her subconscious mind told her that he didn't belong. She couldn't help but stare at the way he moved so confidently, his posture so upright, as though he were royalty. It was then that her unease began to morph into something uglier. "Sorry," she muttered after a long pause, "but we don't serve your kind here." The words left her mouth before she could process them, before she could understand the gravity of what she had just said. Thomas Caldwell's heart sank as he heard the words. He had been through so much in his life, fighting wars, fighting for equality, fighting for the simple dignity of being seen as a human being. But this was something different. It was a raw, ugly form of hate that he hadn't encountered in many years, one that felt more personal than anything he had experienced before. His calm demeanor remained unchanged as he slowly stood up from his booth, the weight of her words lingering in the air between them. He was not one for confrontation, but as he looked at Megan, he realized that this was not something he could simply walk away from. Not this time. The moment the words left Megan's lips, an eerie silence fell over the diner. The clinking of silverware against plates, the hum of the coffee machine, the soft chatter from the other tables, all of it seemed to evaporate in an instant. Megan stared at Thomas Caldwell, her face flushed with something resembling panic, as if she had just realized what she had done. But the damage had already been done. The sharpness of her words hung heavy in the air, and the tension was palpable. For a moment, Thomas didn't react. His face remained stoic, but his eyes that had witnessed so much throughout his life, spoke volumes. He stood still, his posture as straight as the many years he had spent in uniform. It wasn't just his military training that kept him composed, it was the calm resolve of a man who had faced life and death and now, in this moment, faced the ugliness of hatred from a stranger. Megan, on the other hand, was beginning to realize the gravity of her actions. She had said something so harsh, so cruel, without even thinking about the consequences. Her mind raced, but her body was frozen. The look in Thomas's eyes was something she had never seen before, a quiet, unspoken challenge that made her stomach churn. She could feel the weight of the moment, like a thick fog that had settled over her. And yet, despite the discomfort, she couldn't bring herself to apologize. Not yet. Her pride, too caught up in her own discomfort, prevented her from backing down. Thomas finally moved, slowly turning his back on her. He didn't want to cause a scene, he never did, but he wasn't going to sit idly by and let her words fester in the air. He took a step toward the door, his fingers curling around his jacket as he gathered his belongings. The slight jingling of his metals, as they swayed with each movement, was the only sound that broke the silence. It was a subtle reminder that this man was more than just a regular customer. He was a veteran who had served his country, someone who had earned respect, even in the face of adversity. Megan's eyes darted around the room, hoping that someone would step in, that someone would tell Thomas that she hadn't meant it, that it was just a slip of the tongue. But no one said a word. The other customers, having witnessed the exchange, were either too stunned or too uncomfortable to act. The atmosphere in the diner had shifted, and it seemed like every eye was on Megan, silently judging her actions. Feeling the pressure mounting, Megan reached for her phone, her hands trembling slightly as she fumbled for the device. Her mind was racing, but in a panic-induced daze, she could only think to call for help. "I'm calling the police," she blurted out, her voice now wavering with an odd mix of fear and defiance. "You need to leave." Thomas stopped in his tracks, his back still to her. He could feel the sting of her words, but his years of military service had taught him to keep his emotions in check, to stay focused on the task at hand. He didn't turn around to face her, didn't say a word. He knew exactly what was happening. She had just made a decision to escalate the situation, to make it about something bigger than it ever needed to be. Megan, meanwhile, was on the phone now, speaking quickly to the 911 operator. Her words were rushed, frantic. "Yes, I need help. A man is causing trouble in my diner. He's not welcome here, and I'm afraid he's getting aggressive. He's not like the others. I'm really scared." She didn't realize how her words were coming across, how they could easily be interpreted as an exaggerated story of someone trying to justify a hurtful action. Her call to 911 was drenched in her own fear of consequences, her shame starting to bubble to the surface, but she couldn't stop herself now. Her words were out there, and the operator, trained to assess these situations, began to ask follow-up questions about the man's appearance, his demeanor, whether there was any threat. "He's an older black man, wearing a military jacket. He's just sitting there, but he's intimidating. I just don't feel safe." Megan's voice wavered, but she stuck to the narrative she had started, desperate to maintain control over the situation. But as she spoke, her mind was flashing back to the moment she had spoken to Thomas, the way his face had hardened when she spoke, the silence that followed. What had she done? Why had she said those things? It was almost as if a fog had cleared in her mind, and she realized too late how badly she had misjudged the situation. Outside the diner, the hum of the world continued, oblivious to what was happening inside. A few cars passed by, their headlights briefly illuminating the small corner of the town. The streets were quiet, and no one could know what had just unfolded inside the diner. Megan's hands began to shake more noticeably as she continued her conversation with the 911 operator. But in her heart, a knot had formed, a tight, uncomfortable feeling that wouldn't loosen no matter how much she tried to justify her actions. Meanwhile, Thomas, still standing by the door, this paused. He had seen enough to understand what was going on. He had no desire to escalate the situation further, but he wasn't going to leave in shame. He wasn't going to let her deflect blame or make it seem like he had caused the scene. He stood his ground, waiting for the officers to arrive. The weight of his decision pressed against him, but in the end, he remained calm. This wasn't just about one wrongful act. This was about something far larger, a lesson that had to be learned, whether Megan realized it now or later. The silence in the diner was suffocating as Thomas Caldwell stood by the door, his back still turned to Megan. His hand gripped the edge of his jacket, the slight weight of his military medals a reminder of the life he had lived, the battles he had fought, and the sacrifices he had made. As he stood there, his mind flashed back to the years he spent in service, through wars, through struggles, through pain. But none of those experiences had prepared him for this moment. This was different. This wasn't the battlefield. This was a place where he thought he could find comfort, a simple meal, and a quiet afternoon. And yet, here he was, having his dignity questioned by a young woman who didn't even understand the weight of her words. Megan, on the other hand, was now frozen behind the counter. Her hand was still holding her phone, but her mind was no longer fully focused on the conversation with the 911 operator. Her stomach twisted with anxiety and guilt as she replayed the words she had spoken, the moment she had crossed a line that she couldn't erase. She had thought herself so quick, so sharp in her actions, but now the reality of her own prejudice was slowly sinking in. She had called for help, as if Thomas was some kind of threat. But he hadn't threatened anyone. He hadn't raised his voice or even shown a flicker of aggression. He was simply a man sitting in a booth, trying to enjoy his meal. She couldn't help but feel a wave of shame, but there was nothing she could do now. The decision had already been made. She had spoken to the operator, and they were on their way. Despite her panic, Megan couldn't bring herself to call Thomas back over and apologize. The words seemed to choke her, as if the pride and defensiveness that had led her to make that call were now controlling her, too afraid to admit she had made a mistake. She wanted to say something, but the lump in her throat was too large, and the gaze of the other diners was enough to keep her rooted in place. As the seconds stretched into what felt like hours, Thomas's mind remained sharp and steady. He wasn't going to make a scene. He had been through far worse than this, and while it hurt, it wasn't worth losing his composure over. He had learned long ago that reacting in anger was not a victory. The real victory lay in keeping calm, in keeping control. And so he stood there, waiting for the inevitable. A soft bell rang as the door to the diner opened, signaling the arrival of the officers. The air shifted again, tension mounting. The uniformed officers stepped inside, their boots clicking on the tile floor as they scanned the room. They quickly recognized Thomas. It was impossible not to. His distinctive jacket, his stature, and the quiet confidence that marked him as someone of experience. These weren't just local officers. They had served in the same units as Thomas, had been trained alongside him in their youth. His reputation preceded him, and his face was known to them. He was a decorated war hero, one of the few surviving veterans of a generation that had already been forgotten by much of the world. But Megan's story painted a different picture. She explained the situation in a flurry of words, recounting how Thomas had aggressively entered the diner, how he had made her feel unsafe, and how she felt forced to call the authorities. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, but her eyes never left Thomas, still unable to meet his gaze directly. The officers listened patiently, but their eyes shifted from her to Thomas, taking in the scene. They weren't buying her version of events. The older officer, who had worked with Thomas in the past, stepped forward, giving the veteran a respectful nod. He knew the man well enough to understand that this wasn't a situation that would escalate unless Megan continued to feed her own insecurities. His voice was calm as he turned to Thomas. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his tone steady, "I didn't expect to see you here. Is everything all right?" His words were simple, acknowledging Thomas in a way that only a fellow veteran would understand. Thomas, though still hurt, nodded slowly. "It's all right. I came in to eat, but there seems to have been some misunderstanding." The officer turned to Megan, his expression shifting to one of mild disappointment. "You're telling me that a man like Mr. Caldwell, one of the most respected veterans in our community, was causing trouble? Does that sound right to you?" Megan hesitated. Her eyes darted between the officer and Thomas, her guilt now manifesting in the way her hands wrung each other nervously. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, but she wasn't ready to fully admit that she had made a mistake. The truth was too painful for her to face. I didn't mean I thought he was acting strange," she stammered, but her words lacked conviction. The officer raised an eyebrow, waiting for an explanation that made sense, but none came. There was a long silence. The other diners watched intently, some with concern, others with anger, but Thomas remained composed, his face unreadable. He wasn't going to argue with Megan. He wasn't going to stoop to that level. He had learned that sometimes silence was louder than words. The officer turned back to Thomas, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're free to go, Mr. Caldwell. Don't let this young lady's misunderstanding ruin your day. You've earned more respect than she'll ever understand." Megan stood behind the counter, her eyes welling with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, too embarrassed to let anyone see. The officer shot one last look in her direction, but there was no sympathy in his gaze. He had seen this kind of thing before, where fear and ignorance led to harmful decisions, and it was clear to him that Megan had a lot to learn. As Thomas walked toward the door, he gave Megan one last glance. It wasn't a look of anger, but one of quiet disappointment. He didn't need to say anything. His gaze was enough. Without another word, he stepped out into the crisp air, leaving the tension behind him, but not the lesson it carried. As Thomas Caldwell stepped through the door and into the cool air outside, the weight of the moment settled on him, but he refused to let it consume him. His steps were measured, calm, his mind already moving beyond the confrontation that had just occurred in the diner. He had faced far worse, in far more dangerous places than a young woman's misguided words. But as he walked into the quiet street, the soft scrape of his boots on the pavement, he couldn't help but feel a deep, nagging disappointment. He had hoped, naively perhaps, that the world was past such open forms of prejudice, but here he was, reminded once again of the ugliness that still lingered, even in places he thought he understood. His mind shifted back to the moment when Megan had spoken, her words hitting him like a slap to the face. It wasn't just the insult itself that hurt. It was the thought that someone could so easily disregard him based on the color of his skin, dismissing his years of service, his dignity, as if they meant nothing. In that moment, he felt the sting of a past he thought he had left behind, a reminder that some battles were never truly won. Thomas had always prided himself on his ability to let things roll off his back. He had learned that the small, petty battles weren't worth fighting, but the situation in the diner had been different. It wasn't just about a personal insult. It was a reminder of how ingrained prejudice could be and how it often crept up in places you least expected. He had hoped that with time, the world would evolve, but now he realized it wasn't as simple as that. Back inside the diner, Megan was still behind the counter, her hands shaking as she tried to regain some sense of composure. The realization of what had just happened was starting to settle in, and with it came a flood of regret. Her earlier thoughts, her actions, they all felt so rash now, so thoughtless. She could hear the officers speaking to Thomas, their respectful tones, their recognition of his status, and the shame that she had tried to hide bubbled to the surface. She had seen the way they treated him. He was a man of honor, someone who had earned respect simply by living his life. And she, who had so easily dismissed him, had none of that. The more she thought about it, the more the guilt gnawed at her. She had made a quick judgment based on nothing but a gut feeling, an irrational sense of discomfort that had clouded her judgment. And now, she was left standing in the fallout, unable to undo what had already been done. She wanted to apologize, to take back the words she had spoken, but she wasn't sure if it was too late. How could she make it right? Was there even a way to fix something like this? Outside, Thomas kept walking, his breath visible in the brisk air, a silent reflection of the thoughts swirling in his mind. He didn't want to make a scene, didn't want to be the subject of a debate or an apology. The last thing he needed was for people to feel sorry for him. What he needed, what he always needed, was respect. But he knew that respect couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned, and sometimes it had to be patiently waited for. As he walked further down the street, his thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of tires crunching on gravel behind him. He turned slightly, and to his surprise, it was one of the officers, the younger one who had arrived on the scene. The officer had his window rolled down, and his face looked apologetic, though his tone was warm. "Mr. Caldwell," the officer called, pulling up beside him, "I just wanted to make sure you were okay." Thomas gave the officer a small nod, though there was a hint of caution in his eyes. He wasn't in the mood for sympathy, but he knew the officer meant well. "I'm fine, son," Thomas said softly, his voice steady despite the undercurrent of exhaustion. It's been a long time since I've had to deal with something like that." The officer looked at him, clearly unsure of what to say next, but he managed to continue. "I just wanted to tell you that we've spoken with Megan. She's shaken up, and she feels awful about what happened. She's not that kind of person, but I guess—" He hesitated, trying to find the right words. "I think she's just scared of what she doesn't understand." Thomas remained silent for a moment, contemplating the officer's words. He appreciated the sentiment, but it wasn't enough. "I don't need her pity," he said, his voice firm, but not unkind. "What I need is for people to look beyond the surface, to see the man, not the color of his skin." The officer nodded solemnly. "I get it, sir, and I'll make sure she gets the message. We'll deal with this. You don't have to worry about it anymore." Thomas gave a small nod, appreciating the officer's assurance, though he still wasn't convinced that things would change. It was easy for people to offer empty words when there was no real consequence to their actions. But the truth was, things rarely changed unless people were forced to confront their own prejudices. He knew that from experience. The world wasn't as simple as people hoped it would be. The officer gave him a polite nod before driving away, leaving Thomas standing on the sidewalk, lost in thought. He could hear the faint hum of the diner's kitchen behind him, a reminder that life went on inside. But the world outside was a different story. People would go on with their lives, and maybe, just maybe, Megan would think about what happened and learn from it. But in his heart, Thomas knew the truth. This was just one small battle in a much larger war. And as he walked back down the street, his resolve remained unchanged. He would continue to move forward, continuing to hold his head high, even if the world around him couldn't yet see him for who he truly was. The lesson, after all, was not for him to learn. It was for the rest of the world. The following days were filled with a quiet tension that hung over the diner like a shadow. For Megan, the fallout from the incident with Thomas Caldwell weighed heavily on her. Every morning, as she walked into work, she couldn't escape the nagging feeling of guilt that gnawed at her. She replayed the events over and over in her mind, each time her stomach twisted in knots. She had made a hasty judgment, let her own insecurities dictate her actions, and had humiliated a man who deserved nothing but respect. And now, despite the officers telling her not to worry, it was clear that she wasn't going to be able to forget about it so easily. The customers who came into the diner were just as quiet. There were whispers, glances exchanged over the counters, and the usual chatter felt distant and detached. Even the regulars, who usually greeted Megan with smiles or jokes, seemed more reserved. It was as if everyone in town knew what had happened, and no one knew how to address it. Megan avoided eye contact with most of them, embarrassed by the weight of her actions. Every time someone looked at her, she felt the unspoken judgment in their gaze. But it wasn't just the customers who noticed. The other employees, particularly the older waitstaff, could tell something was wrong. Helen, the cook, who had been working in the diner for years, had seen the discomfort on Megan's face and couldn't help but feel a sense of pity for the younger woman. Helen had lived through enough to know when a person was carrying a heavy burden, and it was clear that Megan had one. One afternoon, as Megan wiped down the counter, trying to keep herself busy, Helen walked over and stood beside her. You know, Megan, Helen said, her voice gentle but direct, we all make mistakes. What you did, it wasn't great, but it wasn't the end of the world either. Megan didn't look up at first, her eyes focused on the cloth in her hand, but she could feel Helen's steady gaze on her. It was hard to avoid, hard to escape the truth that was being spoken so plainly. Slowly, she looked up, meeting the older woman's eyes. I can't stop thinking about it, Megan admitted, her voice low. I've been so embarrassed. I acted out of fear, and now I don't know how to make it right. Helen smiled softly, but there was a firmness in her voice when she responded. You can't undo what happened, but you can make sure it doesn't define you. If you're really sorry, you'll show it through your actions. Maybe you won't get a chance to apologize to him directly, but there are always ways to show growth. People can change if they want to. Megan nodded, though the words didn't quite feel like they were sinking in. She knew she had to find a way to make amends, to right the wrong she had done, but how? She couldn't just wait around for the opportunity to present itself. She had to create that chance. The thought of confronting Thomas made her nervous. She knew it would be awkward and uncomfortable, but there was no escaping the fact that an apology was the first step toward healing, at least for her. She had to take responsibility for her actions, even if it meant stepping out of her comfort zone. The following day, Megan found herself driving to the small park just outside town where Thomas often went for walks. She wasn't sure if he'd be there, but something told her it was the right place to start. She parked her car near the entrance and waited, her hands nervously gripping the steering wheel. She had thought about this moment countless times, but now that she was here, the reality felt so much more daunting. After what seemed like hours, but was really just a few minutes, she saw Thomas walking along the path, his familiar jacket and steady gait giving him away before she saw his face. He was alone, his eyes focused ahead, lost in his own thoughts. Megan's heart raced as she stepped out of the car and approached him, her breath catching in her chest. This was it, the moment of truth. Mr. Caldwell, she called out, her voice hesitant but firm. He turned slightly, his gaze immediately recognizing her. There was a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but he said nothing, waiting for her to speak. Megan swallowed hard, the weight of the apology pressing down on her. I wanted to apologize, she started, her words coming out more shakily than she had intended. I was wrong. I treated you unfairly the other day. I acted out of fear, and I let my own ignorance guide me. I should never have spoken to you the way I did. You didn't deserve that. Thomas remained silent, but his expression softened ever so slightly, the hard lines in his face easing. Megan continued, trying to push past the nerves that threatened to choke her words. I know I can't undo what happened, but I want you to know that I see you. I see who you are, and I see the man you've become, and I'm sorry. I've learned something from this, and I promise you I'll be better. For a moment, Thomas didn't say anything, and Megan began to feel the familiar heat of embarrassment creeping up her neck. She had expected him to speak, to offer some kind of response, but he remained quiet, his face unreadable. It felt like an eternity. But then, just as Megan was about to speak again, Thomas finally spoke, his voice low but steady. Sometimes it takes a lot for people to open their eyes, he said, and sometimes it takes a lot more for people to admit when they're wrong. But you did that, and that's what matters. I'm not looking for an apology, but I appreciate it. Megan's breath caught in her throat, a mixture of relief and guilt flooding her. She had expected an easier forgiveness, but there was something about Thomas's words that felt real. There was no pretense in his tone, no judgment, just the quiet acceptance of someone who had learned to navigate the world with patience and understanding. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice full of gratitude. Thomas nodded once, then turned to continue his walk. Megan watched him for a moment, her heart heavy but lighter than it had been in days. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but in that moment she had taken the first step toward healing, toward growth, and most importantly, toward understanding. The road ahead would be long, but it was a road she was willing to walk.